Hello and welcome to Pocket-Sized Apologetics. I am Ken Coughlin. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to be, for those that haven't watched the show before, this is a show where I ask you for about 30 minutes or so to put your thinking cap on as we talk about some of the evidences in favor of the Christian faith. Last week I went through kind of the big picture argument as far as taking what the steps are that we're taking all the way from complete skepticism or agnosticism all the way through the existence of God and all the way specifically to the Christian faith. And if you've watched that episode, you can see where we're at right now as we've been talking about step 3, which is that the theistic God exists. And I've spent the last many episodes, almost 80 episodes, going through the various different arguments for the existence of God, affirmative arguments for the existence of God. But what I want to do starting now is I want to take a look at some of the arguments that are offered in favor of atheism. In other words, and honestly, there aren't that many, but what arguments are available or are offered by atheists to supposedly affirmatively prove their case? So they're not just responding to the theistic arguments and saying those arguments aren't good enough, but they're actually offering affirmative arguments of their own. And probably the number one argument that is offered in favor of atheism is the problem of evil. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be spending the next 3 episodes talking about that. That's my plan for 3. We'll see how things go. But next 3 episodes talking about that. So I'd invite you to come along for the ride. And if you do have any questions and you're watching this live, you can go ahead and put them in the live chat, and I'll be happy to try to answer them on the air. I will tell you today I've really got to be strict to the 30-minute deadline. I got a 12:30 meeting. So once I got to shut everything down here and then bolt out of here to get to that. So it's a busy day. So we're going to be sticking pretty strictly to that. So if you do have any questions, try to get them in early. All right. So first of all, what I want to do and what we're going to do today, just to kind of outline it for you, is first I'm going to explain what the problem of evil is. All right. Kind of outline a little bit. Talk a little bit about the form that responses to it need to take, and then we're going to answer the most fundamental question we need to answer when we're looking at this question, I think, is what is evil? I mean, it's a term that we all use, but what exactly does it mean? Because once we decide what it means, that's going to shape the responses that we give to this question, obviously. So what I want to do first here is we are going to first talk about what the problem of evil is and how it's been expressed there we go. How it's been expressed by atheists. And this is probably one of the most famous formulations of it. It's from atheist philosopher David Hume. And what Hume says is he asks a very pertinent question. He says, speaking of God now, if God is willing to prevent evil but not able to, then he is impotent. If he is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. If he is both able and willing, whence then is evil? Why is there evil? To simplify it a little bit, Douglas Groothuis, in his book Christian Apologetics, A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith, spells it out like this. If we were to look at the argument in terms of premises and a conclusion, he says, premise 1, God's power means God can prevent any evil, since God can do absolutely anything. So God has the ability to prevent evil if he wants to. All right? Premise 2, God's goodness means he would prevent any evil. So if God truly is good, then he's going to want to prevent evil. So what do we have so far? We've got, according to these first 2 premises, we have a God who is capable of preventing evil and should want to prevent evil. But then we get to premise 3, but we look around, but there is evil as a practical matter. And the conclusion that it draws is therefore God cannot exist. All right? That's kind of the shape of the argument from evil, is that at least when it says God cannot exist, it's really meaning the Christian God can't exist. This idea of an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God, a God who is all-powerful and all-loving, that kind of God definitely can't exist according to this argument, because if so, he would have the ability to prevent evil, he would have the desire to prevent evil, so we shouldn't be seeing any evil. And yet we do, therefore that God can't exist. Now this form of the argument is what is referred to by philosophers as the logical problem of evil. Now what the logical problem of evil states is it claims that there is a logical contradiction between believing that evil exists and believing that an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God exists, okay? That those two, it's kind of like the law of non-contradiction, saying someone is pregnant and is not pregnant at the same time. Well, that can't be true because that's a contradiction. So this formulation of the problem, those who advance it this way say it's very similar, is that you can't say that evil exists and that this idea of the Christian God exists, those two are logically contradictory. Now, very few people we'll get to that in a second, but I want to give a very preliminary note to this first, all right? And the preliminary note I want to give is this. Understand, based on what we've been talking about over the past several episodes, not last week, but the 3 weeks before that, we went over the moral argument for the existence of God. And what we talked about when we were looking at the moral argument is that when you define something as evil, all right, you're actually assuming that God exists, because in order you need God in order to give you that transcendent moral standard that defines what is good and what is evil in the first place. So by saying evil exists in the world, that statement in and of itself has a hidden assumption in it, and that hidden assumption is that God exists. And so by even advancing this argument in this way, the skeptic is actually assuming the very thing they're seeking to disprove. All right? I'm not going to go into that anymore and rehash that ground. We covered that in detail over 3 episodes on the moral argument. I just refer you back to those if you're interested. But what I do want to go on to talking about the logical problem of evil now is to explain that very few people actually still advance in this way. All right, you're not going to find. I mean, you might find some internet skeptics and everything that try to claim that it is a logical contradiction between the two, but not too much in scholarly circles. And there's a very good reason for that. Let's take a look at this. What you've got back on the screen here are the premises and the conclusion of the argument. Well, let me ask you something there about premise 2. It says God goodness means that he would prevent any evil. Well, isn't it theoretically possible, whether we know what it is or not, it's theoretically possible that God could have some good reasons for allowing certain evil instances to happen, so for allowing certain amounts of evil to exist? As long as it's theoretically possible, and of course most philosophers concede, yes, it's at least theoretically possible that God could have good reasons for allowing evil events to occur. All right. Well, if that's the case, as long as it's at least logically possible that God could have legitimate moral reasons for allowing evil acts to occur, then premise 2 falls apart. All right. It's not necessarily true that God's goodness would mean he would prevent any evil that he comes across. Maybe he's got good reasons for allowing certain ones. And if he has good reasons for allowing certain ones, then the premise 2 fails. All right. And so for that reason, because almost everybody today will concede that it is at least theoretically possible that God has good reasons for allowing evil to exist, they'll agree that this formulation of the argument, the logical form, doesn't hold up. All right. Which is why, well, first of all, this is what we call a defense, all right? A defense is a response to the problem of evil that shows that there's no logical contradiction between the Christian concept of God and the existence of evil, all right? Now, the problem is that we come across is nowadays, as I said, most skeptics concede that there is not a logical contradiction between the existence of God or the Christian God and the problem of evil. So instead, they advance a slightly different version of the problem of evil or the argument from evil, and it's what we call the evidential problem of evil. All right, now the evidential problem of evil says this: given that evil exists, which frankly, we all agree with. Christians and atheists alike will agree that there's evil out there in the world. Given that evil exists, it is unlikely that an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent being exists. In other words, this variety says there's so much evil in the world that we just don't think it's a likely possibility that a loving God exists. All right, now for this variation, when we're responding to this variation of the problem of evil, a defense isn't going to do us any good. All right, remember, a defense just says it's logically possible that God has some legitimate reason for allowing it. All right, and an atheist would look at you and say, yes, it's logically possible, but how likely is it? All right, I'm not convinced that that's actually probable. It may be possible, but I'm not convinced it's probable that God has a legitimate reason for allowing evil to exist. And unless I'm convinced that it's probable, then I'm going to say that it's probable that God doesn't exist, or the Christian God doesn't exist. All right, so that's the difference between advancing it as a logical issue and as an evidential issue. Now, in order to respond to the evidential variety, the evidential problem of evil, we need to advance what's called a theodicy. All right, a theodicy, that term theodicy actually comes from 2 Greek terms which literally mean the justification of God. All right, so in this scenario, it's no longer good enough for us just to vaguely say that God may have had a good reason for allowing evil. We need to offer up some specific, plausible reasons that he may have done so. All right? Now, when we're doing that, when we're coming up with these and advancing these theoretical reasons why God may have allowed evil, we need to keep in mind two different things, two different types of evil, or what philosophers commonly refer to as two different types of evil, that need to be addressed. All right. The first one is what's called natural evil. All right. Natural evil is evil that results from natural causes, things like starvation, disease, physical deformity, natural disasters, etc. Why does God allow those? And the other type of evil is what's called moral evil. All right. Moral evil is evil that results from personal depravity, torture, murder, war, cheating, exploitation, things like that. All right. So when you're responding to the problem of evil, you need to respond to both. And it's entirely possible, as a matter of fact, it is the case, we'll see as we get into the next 2 weeks, that any one particular theodicy might not address both. So you kind of need a big picture look at it. God may have multiple reasons for allowing these different types of things. Now, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be spending the next 3 episodes talking about the problem of evil. Now this week, what I'm going to do is, now that I kind of outlined the basic structure of what the problem is and what a proper response would look like, I'm going to try to define what evil is. All right, what is it exactly we're responding to? And then over the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about 2 different theodicies that are offered up to explain why God would allow evil. Specifically, next week, we'll talk about the free will theodicy, and the following week, we're going to talk about what's called the soul-making theodicy, or sometimes soul-building theodicy. So, turning our attention to our topic for today, what is evil? All right. Some people say that if God created everything in the universe, all right, and evil is in fact something that's in the universe, then God must have created evil. Is that a fair criticism to launch against God? Well, we've got a couple responses here. I'm going to put them on the screen for you. These are representative. The first one is from Augustine. And Augustine had said that evil itself is not a thing, but rather it's a privation of what is good. And I don't know if he's watching right now, but I want to share this. A gentleman by the name of David Prentice had some really good examples of this. That David, if you do watch it, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. When I posted on Facebook the link to this program, he responded to it. He says that in his science classes, he's always emphasized a few things to his students. And these are examples of what Augustine is talking about a privation. He says, number 1, there's no such thing as cold. Cold is the absence of heat, all right? The second thing he says, there's no such thing as dark. Dark is the absence of light, all right? And the last example he gives is there's no such thing as a vacuum. Vacuum is the absence of pressure. Really good examples, and thank you, David, for sharing those. That's what Augustine is getting at here. He's saying there's no such thing as evil in and of itself. Evil is the absence of good. God created what is good, all right? So because evil is not a thing in and of itself, God didn't create it. He created good. And when we have an absence of good, when we, through our fallen nature, have taken away the good, so to speak, and left a hole there, then that's where evil is apparent. Let me give you another layperson example. And again, these are just... These are illustrations, these are metaphors to help you kind of picture what Augustine is talking about here. So if this doesn't help you, forget about it, but some people it might. Let's pretend you're walking down the street, all right, or on a sidewalk. You're walking down a sidewalk, and normally when the sidewalk is there under your feet, everything's going smoothly, right? One foot after the other is just hitting on the sidewalk, and you can keep walking, whistling, whatever you want to do on a nice spring day, and you're happy as can be. But now let's pretend there's a hole in the sidewalk, and you don't see it. All right, what's going to happen when you get to that hole? You're going to fall into it, right? And you're going to get hurt, and something bad is going to happen. Is the hole, in and of itself, a thing in the same way like the sidewalk is a thing? No. The hole is just the absence of the sidewalk, isn't it? There was a sidewalk, and now there's not, or maybe the absence of the dirt underneath it as well, depending, of course, on how deep the hole is. That's an analogy for what Augustine is talking about here, is about evil is the absence of good. It's when that sidewalk is taken away, that's when bad things happen, all right? Another way of looking at it, which is related but slightly different, is C.S. Lewis here. And this is in his book, from his book, Mere Christianity. He says, evil is a parasite, not an original thing. All the things which enable a bad man to be effectively bad are in themselves good things: resolution, cleverness, good looks, existence itself. The badness consists in pursuing them by the wrong method, or in the wrong way, or too much. All right? So, whereas Augustine uses language of privation or the absence of something, Lewis talks about things being a parasite, that evil is a parasite on something good. Think of it like rust. That's a classic example that's often thrown out there. You can't have rust by itself, can you? You first have to have metal. All right. It's only when, and metal is a good thing. We build things out of it, all that. But it's only once you have the metal that you can then have rust. The rust is a corruption of that metal. All right. You're not going to be able to go out into the world and just point, oh, look, there's some rust, unless you're also pointing to something metal. All right. So that's the way C.S. Lewis looks at it, is that it's a corruption of something that's good. It's not a thing in and of itself. So two different ways of looking at it, but both kind of getting to the same point, and that is that evil itself is not its own thing. All right. It's either an absence of something or a corruption of something. God created everything, but everything he created was good. And it's only when we either take away that good or we corrupt that good that we see evil, and that's not God's doing. That's not his action, okay? Now, what I do want to take a little side note here is to point out where I kind of differ from a lot of philosophers on the way they categorize natural evil and moral evil. When I look at these explanations that are offered up by Augustine and that are offered up by C.S. Lewis, I agree that they do seem to apply pretty clearly to cases of moral evil, the evil that results from personal action, personal depravity. The evil choices that we make and the actions that we take certainly do appear to be a privation or a twisting of something that is by its nature good. The best. Well, I'll give you an example. I was going to give this at the end of the episode, but I'll stick it in here. Even anger. We talk about violent acts being taken out of anger. Well, is anger per se a bad thing? No. We've all heard of righteous indignation, right? Jesus himself was angry at the money changers in the temple courts and at the religious leaders of his time who were placing these enormous yokes of obligation upon the Jewish people. So anger itself can be useful and can be a very good thing to call out injustice. There are things we should be angry about. And us getting angry at them is what can hopefully correct the injustices from continuing or from happening. But where anger goes wrong is when it's misused, when it's misdirected. All right? So that's what I mean by, if I look at these explanations offered by Augustine and by C.S. Lewis, I can see where they can apply to moral evil, evil actions, evil choices that are made by individuals, by people. But I've never really thought that those definitions applied very well or fit very well into the realm of natural evil. If somebody disagrees with me, feel free to disagree with me, but that's kind of the way I've looked at it. I've never felt it fits very well into natural evil. I mean, how is a tornado, for example, a privation of something good? All right, an absence of something good. I don't necessarily, I have a hard time seeing it fit into that definition. And the conclusion that I've come to personally, and again, if this helps you, great. If it doesn't, whatever, go with what does. But I think that there's kind of an unfortunate tendency of a lot of philosophers to try to fit two kind of different things under the same umbrella, and that being the umbrella of evil. I've never been a fan of referring to natural phenomena as evil or evils, all right? Because the term evil is a moral term. For it to make sense, you have to be referring to a moral agent, all right? Or a tornado, for example, doesn't have a mind. It isn't capable of choosing whether it's going to turn to the right or to the left. Is it going to turn toward this town or toward the open field? Or tornado doesn't make a choice, all right? It just acts. All right, and so it seems to me like referring to things like these natural phenomenon as evil is something of a category error. A category error is something like saying the color blue smells nice. All right, colors don't have a smell to them. Not talking about crayons here, okay? Talking about the color itself. The color blue doesn't have a smell. That's not a category that we can apply to a color. All right. So describing and trying to describe it that way is committing what's called a category error. Similarly, I think using those moral terms of good or evil, those aren't really categories that apply to non-moral agents like natural phenomenon. A moral agent is someone who's capable of making a choice and can be responsible for that choice, who's responsible for their actions, who has some control over their actions. Like a person, all right? People are moral agents for that reason. Tornadoes are not moral agents. They're just things that just act naturally according to the laws of nature. And so I don't really like using the term evil to describe natural phenomenon. Now, we still need to offer up a theodicy for them. Just because I'm saying that I don't really think these natural phenomena properly fall under the category of evil doesn't mean that there's not still a legitimate question about them, about why God allows them. There certainly is. And so that's still something we need to be prepared to answer. But I just don't like them. But there's still also, we have to recognize there's something fundamentally different about the two. And so I like C.S. Lewis's term in his book, The Problem of Pain, where, I mean, a tornado is just a tornado. There's nothing inherently evil in it. It's only when it ravages its way through a populated area that we're confronted with some kind of problem, right? And it's when it ravages its way through a populated area, that's where it causes pain. It might not be evil, but it certainly causes some, physical, emotional pains. And so I think when we're talking about natural phenomenon, I kind of like phrasing the question this way. If a loving God exists, why do we see so much pain caused by natural events? All right. It may seem small and semantic, and if it means nothing to you, it means nothing to you. But I think it's an important distinction to make. Again, we still need to offer up a theodicy for it, and we're going to get to that. So what have we been talking about today? All right. First of all, we've mentioned that evil, at least according to my position, I think evil is only a term that can be applied to moral agents, all right? In other words, to people. But second, when we're talking about what evil means, evil refers to a privation, according to Augustine, or a twisting or corruption, according to C.S. Lewis, of something that is in itself a good thing, all right? So it's not a thing in and of itself, all right? So now, hopefully, with that understanding, that groundwork laid, we have a solid understanding of what evil means. So we know what it is we're responding to. And like I said, we're actually going to be responding to, we have an obligation to respond to both the question of why does God allow evil and why does God allow so much pain through non-moral agents as well, like natural phenomena and things like that. So with that being said, what we're going to do is next week we're going to start looking at some explanations as to why God might allow some of these things to exist. Specifically, next week we're going to look at what's called the free will theodicy, which has to do with God giving us free will and what the implications are of that. All right. So I'm not going to go into that right now because we're out of time. It's 12:24, and like I said, I got a 12:30 meeting. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. If you do have any questions, even not watching us live, you can put them in the comments section, and I will try to read those comments between now and next week, and I will address any of your questions on the air next week if you put them in the comments section. Otherwise, if you can join us live here Fridays at noon, that's obviously best because we can interact right here through the live chat. All right. Thank you all very much for joining me today. See you next week. God bless.